So I often will start by talking about some kind of a funny story, often from my childhood, something just to sort of break the ice, but I need to be a little more serious this morning. And a lot of you don't know, I suffer from a condition. It's called the man look. It's the inability to find something even when it is right in front of you. I imagine some of you may know someone who suffers from this as well. Some of you ladies may be married to someone who suffers from man look. There's no known cure. I'm just raising awareness today. The worst case, thanks for laughing. I'm glad somebody enjoyed it. The worst case scenario for me is when it's bad enough when it's like right in front of me and I can't see it, but if I'm looking in the wrong cupboard, if I'm like looking at the pantry and I know we've got something here, Kathy says we've got it here, and I'm waiting for her to come around the corner and say, look, it's right here, and I'll be like, oh, but then, she'll open the pantry, the other cupboard. I'm like, okay, I didn't even have a prayer. I didn't even have a prayer because I couldn't possibly look in more than one place. It's just... There's a movie, I'm hoping we're not dating it too much, called Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Show of hands who's seen it. The rest of you, shame on you. Shame on you. It's one, like, my kids would probably say, oh, that's ancient. It's like, no, it's not. Okay, it's a really good movie, a little dated, that's all. In the movie, they're looking for the lost Ark of the Covenant. And the reason Indy is looking for it is because Hitler is looking for it. The idea behind it is they feel like, the Nazis feel like if they have this good luck charm of the Ark of the Covenant going into battle with them, then they'll be undefeated. They look at the stories of the Old Testament and say, look, it's like the secret of Israel's power was the Ark of the Covenant. And, the idea behind the story is if the Nazis have that, then they'll just run over the whole world. So Indy has to find it first. And no one knows where it is except for, there's a clue on an amulet. And Indy, of course, has the full amulet. The bad guys, they only have half the amulet. And so they're digging in this place in Egypt, and Indy goes there, and he realizes, okay, they've only got half the information, but the other half of the amulet tells you some really important information. So, long story short story long, anyway, they're looking in the wrong place. Because they don't have all the information, they're looking in the wrong place. They'll never find what they're looking for. I wonder how many of us are looking in the wrong place. Obviously, I'm not talking about archaeology. I'm not talking about stuff in the cupboard either. How many of us are looking for happiness in the wrong place? How many of us are looking for lasting fulfillment in a place where we will never find it? How many are looking for a full life in a place where God never intended it to be? I saw this quote, Seymour Clast, never heard of this guy before. If you're digging a hole in the wrong place, keep making it deeper won't help anything. You will never find what you're looking for if you look in the wrong place. And the big idea today is that don't expect to find God's promises in places where God didn't promise them to be. Don't expect to find God's promises in places where God didn't promise them to be. I mean, God has made promises to us, but we sometimes take part of that promise and try to put it somewhere else. We only have half the amulet in a sense. We have half the information, or we only want to listen to one part of it, and we say, well, I expect to find the thing that God promised me somewhere that God says, I never told you it was going to be there. For some people, it's relationships. They put all their hope in this idea of a relationship. And as we're going to find out here, some of this stuff is not necessarily bad. Some of it's very good. But if we put too much emphasis on it, or if we make it take the place of something that shouldn't, then there's no hope that it's going to satisfy what we need. Some people, it's success. Other people, it's the accumulation of stuff. If I just had one more thing, if I just had, next pair of shoes, that's me. I want to buy another pair of shoes right now. For some of us, it's food, and that's kind of tricky. That's also me. And I don't say that to just get an easy laugh. I mean, it's tricky because it's vital, right? We need to have food, but sometimes we let food take the place that it should not take in our lives. At their best, none of these things can fulfill the need you have for Jesus. We're doing a series called Lost and Found. And this, in case you haven't been here before, this is intentionally supposed to look like something called a flannel graph. So when I was a little kid in Sunday school, we had a flannel graph. It was like a piece of flannel. And the teacher would take a little cutout and they'd put it on the board and they'd tell us the stories, often from the Old Testament, sometimes from the New Testament, but for me I remember the ones most from the Old Testament. And they would teach us the Bible lesson using this now somewhat archaic method. For us, the flannel graph is the PowerPoint. But we're looking at the stories of the Israelites in the wilderness. So the time between when they left Egypt, when they were slaves in Egypt, they escaped from Egypt, up until the time they entered the Promised Land, there's 40 years that take place. And there's all these, for me, fascinating, incredible stories that take place during those years. But the twist we're putting on it for this series is that we're looking for Jesus in the wilderness. In some ways, it's like the Israelites were lost, and they were just wandering, meandering for 40 years. Didn't have to be that long, but it turns out it was that long. Now, they had no idea about Jesus, but what can we learn about Jesus from these stories? That's the idea behind this whole series. So where are we so far in this series? We're just going to do a bit of a recap here. It started with the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, it started before that. Moses, God calls Moses to go and says, I want you to lead my people. Pharaoh, let my people go. And they escape from Egypt, and they get to the Red Sea, and it's like a dead end. It's hopeless. And God makes a way. He says, Moses, take your staff, put it in the water, or hold it out over the water, and the Israelites cross over on dry land. And it's this incredible story of salvation. And then there's these miracles that happen in the wilderness. I mean, people have legitimate needs. They're hungry, they're thirsty, and there's no water, and there's no food, and God provides them in miraculous ways. He brings, quail from the sky. He brings manna that falls, and manna, literal translation is, what is it? Because they had never seen anything like this before. And for 40 years, they survived on this bread-like substance that God brought forward for them, and only them, faithfully. And it's just these incredible miracles. The water's bitter. God says, throw a piece of wood in there, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it does. And it happens. It makes the water drinkable. And all these incredible stories are happening, and God is behind all of them. They get to Mount Sinai, and God says, these are the kind of people I want you to be. And he takes some time teaching them who he wants them to be. And then there's everything else that happens in all these stories. And if you haven't been here, you can find them on our website, some of the stories that we've talked about. And there's more on top of that. When I was coming up with the series, I had a big list. I was like, I got to narrow this down to just a few of my personal favorites. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the Israelites coming to the border of the Promised Land. This whole process should have only been 2 years. God said, I want to take you out into the wilderness. I want to teach you who I want you to be, and then I want you to go into the Promised Land. And that should have taken 2 years. But they get to the Promised Land, and they are afraid of what's there. They're afraid of the enemy. They lose faith that God is going to do incredible things. And so God's punishment for them is that you're going to wander. And this entire generation of a certain age and up who didn't have the faith to go into the Promised Land is never going to enter the Promised Land, with a couple of exceptions. They get back to wandering after that. Because what else are you going to do? I mean, some people say we want to go back to Egypt, and Moses is not going to lead them back to Egypt. God is not going to lead them back to Egypt, because God still has a purpose for these people. Some people said, well, let's take the land anyway. They tried that. It didn't work. All that's left for them to do is to wander for the next 38 years. A couple more stories that happen after this. There's a rebellion that God puts down pretty severely. It almost made the cut, but I just thought, I got other stories I want to tell. There's a couple of chapters about how priests are to do their duties. And then the people get thirsty again. And there's these stories about the Israelites getting thirsty that almost in a sense bookend the two parts of the story. I mean, there's a literal bookend of crossing the Red Sea and crossing the Jordan River, but almost right afterwards and almost right before are these other two stories about the Israelites getting thirsty. And so today we're going to be in Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 to 13. It says, in the first month of the year, the whole community of Israel arrived in the wilderness of Zin and camped at Kadesh. While they were there, Miriam died and was buried. Now, it's interesting because if you're just sort of skipping across the stories as we've been, you don't really know how much time has passed here, but there's a lot of time has passed here. I mean, we're almost now to the end of the time in the wilderness. So this is like fast forward, 38 years because nothing really happened. But we get to this point now where Miriam died and was buried. And if you haven't been reading along the story, you don't really know maybe who Miriam is, but she is the sister of Moses. And so you've got these key leaders in Israel. I mean, these are the people who probably everyone else would have looked up to. There's the tribal leaders and whoever they were. There were the spies who went into the land. Now only 2 of them are left. But the big ones were Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Like they were like probably the ones that everyone else would know. They were the camp celebrities in a sense. And God has told them that this entire generation is going to die in the wilderness, and now finally one of the big 3 has died. And it's like confirmation. Oh yeah. I mean, it's one thing when your neighbor dies, but when this famous person dies, it's like, this is real. Just as God said, the wilderness became a graveyard for that generation of Israelites. We get to verse 2. It says, there was no water for the people to drink at that place. So they rebelled against Moses and Aaron. And as we've seen, this is just the way it goes. Something goes wrong, and it's like almost immediate rebellion. Complaining, grumbling, and rebellion. It's like the Israelite people, they can't get rid of Moses and Aaron. It's almost like they wish they could start over with somebody else, but God says, no, these are my leaders. These are the people who I've chosen, and when you rebel against them, you're rebelling against me. And yet, every time something goes wrong, they rebel. The people blame Moses and said, it's like they're playing all the hits, If only we had died in the Lord's presence with our brothers. Why have you brought the congregation of the Lord's people into this wilderness to die along with our livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here to this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, no water to drink. It's like the same thing happens every time something goes wrong. They complain. They forget how bad things were in Egypt. I wish we could have gone back to Egypt. Why did you ever take us out of that wonderful place where we were slaves and screaming for freedom? They forget that last little bit. It's like maybe over the course of 40 years, all they have is good memories of what was, and forget that they were crying out to God to save them. But it's this last part that I really want to focus on. This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, no water to drink. And they're right. They're 100% right about that. But I can almost picture God saying, it's not supposed to. You guys forget, you're not supposed to be here right now. You want grain, you want figs, you want grapes, you want pomegranates, you want good water? That was all waiting for you in the promised land. That's what I had waiting for you, ready for you, but you and your parents, you didn't have the faith to take it. So why would you expect it to be here in the wilderness? Don't expect to find God's promises in places where God didn't promise them to be. Moses and Aaron turned away from the people and went to the entrance of the tabernacle, where they fell face down on the ground. And this is sort of par for the course for them as well. Early on, when the people complained and they started to rebel, Moses tried to argue with them. And at this point, you can tell he's just like, I've had enough. Anytime they rebel, I'm giving this over to God. You fight with me, I don't want to fight with you. I'm giving it to God. I'm just going to fall face down in front of God and let Him take care of the situation. Now, the rebellion that happened not too long before this, God deals with it in a very, very serious way. The people are rebelling. God opens up the ground and swallows up the rebellion, closes the ground up. I mean, it's something that if it wasn't in the Bible, it was like, that sounds like a cool Marvel movie scene or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily believe it. But I believe it because it's in the Bible. And I believe that's how God deals with rebellion. Not always that way, but severely. So Moses and Aaron turned away from the people, and they went to the entrance of the tabernacle, where they fell face down on the ground. Then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to them. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I mean, we know from the story that God, leads them by a cloud of smoke by the day and a pillar of fire by night, and maybe that's what this is looking like. Maybe it's some other manifestation of God's presence, but at any rate, it's like the people are saying, we don't want you, Moses and Aaron, and God saying, tough, because these are my people. These are my guys. And so the Lord said to Moses, you and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community. As the people watch, speak to the rock over there. It will pour out its water. You will provide enough water from the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. Very clear instructions. I mean, there's not a lot of confusion there. Take your staff. I mean, that's the symbol of authority. Assemble the entire community. Make sure everyone's there to see it. As the people watch, speak to the rock. It will pour out its water. You'll provide enough water. I mean, as much as these people are probably miserable to be around, grumbling, complaining, rebelling all the time, they're still God's chosen people. He still loves them. He still wants to care for them. He still wants to provide for them. I mean, it's a legitimate need. They're thirsty. There's no water. The problem is, instead of coming to God in faith, they come in rebellion and anger. But God still is going to provide for them. And so Moses did what he's told. He took the staff, again, which is the symbol. The staff is not a magical staff. It's just the symbol of God's authority. So Moses is basically saying, I'm not doing this on my own. I'm doing this under the authority of God. He took the staff from the place where it was kept before the Lord. Then he and Aaron summoned the people to come and gather at the rock. So far, so good. Right? Clear instructions, and he's following them. But this is where it goes off the rails. Listen, you rebels, he shouted. And I can understand how he's feeling right now. I mean, if I was him, I would probably do the same thing. People complaining all the time, rebelling all the time. He's frustrated, he's angry, he wants to just get it out. You rebels, he shouted. But he lets his emotions take over. I mean, God did not tell him to chastise the people. He said, go speak to the rock. Moses takes it on himself to call them rebels, which they were, but God didn't tell him to do that. It gets worse. He says, must we bring you water from this rock? Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out. So the entire community and their livestock drank their fill. Now, why was this so bad? As we find out in a moment, this was bad. But why was it so bad? A couple of reasons. First of all, Moses misrepresents God. I mean, the people looked at Moses as like the representation of who God was. So the idea of God in their mind was sort of like filtered down through Moses. And most of the time, Moses did a really good job of representing God. But here, he comes across as somebody who's angry, someone who's bitter back to the people. He's short with his frustration. He's calling them names. That's not who God is. And so he misrepresents who God is. Even worse, he diminishes God by elevating himself. What did God say? He said, speak to the rock. What did Moses say? Must we bring you water from this rock? Moses is putting himself up on a pedestal. Now, I don't know if he means we by like Aaron and I, or we like God and I, but either way, he's saying, me. I'm the one who's doing this, not God. Or at best, it's me and God. And maybe there's a little bit of him that's like, these people want to get rid of me. I need to help them realize that I'm important. It's me and God, right? Like I'm the representative, I'm the guy. But God didn't tell him to do that. And he diminishes God by elevating himself. God is holy, totally other, separate from humans. He doesn't need Moses to do this. He chooses Moses to do his work, but he doesn't need him. And then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with a staff. Now, what did God tell him to do? Speak to the rock. But he strikes it, not just once, but twice. So he disobeys God. And yet God still provides for the people, which is, again, a beautiful image of who God really is. Even with their failure to be the kind of people God wants them to be, God still loves them enough to provide for them. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I am giving them." So when God said, this entire generation over a certain age is not going to be in the promised land, I'm sure there was some question as to, does that include Moses and Aaron? And Miriam? Well, Miriam's passed away, and now God makes it clear, neither you or Aaron are going to get it either. This place was known as the waters of Meribah, which means arguing, because there the people of Israel argued with the Lord, and there he demonstrated his holiness among them. So Moses unfortunately found out that actions have consequences. He disobeyed, he did something he wasn't supposed to do. And the consequence is that he is not going to lead his people into the Holy Land. He's led them for 40 years now in the wilderness. And they get right up to the edge, and they don't get in. Moses and Aaron don't get in. He also finds out that no one is above the law. He's God's representative. God time and again says, no, this is my guy. When you rebel against him, you rebel against me. But it doesn't mean that he gets to do whatever he wants. No one is above the law. As the pastor, I'm the spiritual leader of the church, but I'm not above the law. I don't get to do whatever I want. I don't get to make the rules the way I see them. We do our best in the church to make the rules according to the way we understand them as God says them. And lastly, he finds out that God's standard is perfection. You look at the journey of Moses and all the amazing things that he did. Aaron, he did the thing with the calf and the idol. If you don't know the story, look it up. Moses, for the most part, he's almost perfect. It's really frustrating when you look at him and think, man, he's so good. But he's not perfect. And God's standard is perfection. Which brings us to Jesus. Because the Bible tells us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is absolutely nobody who is perfect. But Jesus is perfect. And anything great about us is because we are in Christ's perfection, that Christ is in us. He covers us with his perfection. But how do we see Jesus in this story? We're talking about water. And just like the last time we talked about water and the Israelites being thirsty, Jesus said, anyone who drinks this water, talking about the water he's providing, will soon become thirsty. He's talking about the water of the well. Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give them will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. He's not talking about literal water. He's talking about metaphorical water, the life-giving presence of Christ in us. Again, in John 7, he said, anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink. For the scriptures declare, rivers of living water will flow from his heart. But the New Testament passage that talks really about this story is from 1 Corinthians. Paul writes this in chapter 10. He's saying to the church in Corinth, he says, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, I don't want you to forget about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. They would have known the stories. They would have grown up on them. They would have understood what Paul was talking about. All of them were guided by the cloud that moved ahead of them, the presence of God's glory. All of them walked through the sea on dry ground. We already talked about that this morning. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food. All of them drank the same spiritual water, for they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them. That rock was Christ. He goes on and says, yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. That's the whole story from their side. But this idea that Paul is teaching them that Christ is there's different theories on this. There's some people who say that that is literally Christ, others who say it's metaphorical. I don't really want to get into all that. What I want to talk about is Exodus 17. So the last time the Israelites were thirsty, God said to Moses, take your staff, hit the rock, water will come out. This time he says to him, speak to the rock. I mean, you can almost understand Moses saying, I thought when we did this kind of thing, we're supposed to hit the rock, no? But when God gives you clear instructions, you need to follow those clear instructions. These, in some ways, almost seem like somewhat confusing. Strike the rock, don't strike the rock, which is it? Why? And the answer is something called typology. Okay, I'm not going to get too deep here. Typology is simply the idea that people look back in the Old Testament, they see stories, and they say, that's kind of like what happened with Christ. So last week, my dad was speaking, he talked about as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. If you don't know what that's about, you can look it up online. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up on the cross. Okay, the serpent is not Jesus, but you can sort of see the similarity, right? Like anyone who was sick and dying looked at the serpent, they were saved. Anyone who is spiritually dying can look to Jesus and they can be saved. So that's the idea of typology. You see things in the Old Testament and it makes it like the New Testament. Moses leads the people out of slavery. Jesus leads his people out of slavery to sin. Moses is not Jesus, but you can sort of see Jesus in that story. Israel sacrifices a lamb to remove their sin. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Typology. So in Exodus chapter 17, God says, I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock, and water will come gushing out. The people will be able to drink. So Moses struck the rock as he was told. Water gushed out as the elders looked on. That's the first time. Right? Paul tells us that Jesus was the rock that was struck so that people could live. Again, I think it's probably more of a metaphorical sense. But Jesus is struck. Hebrews 10:10 says, for God's will was for us to be made holy by the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ, once for all time. So Jesus died on the cross. He was struck. He was physically injured. But Jesus doesn't die every time you sin. It was once for all time. So the rock in the wilderness was struck once, and it didn't need to be struck again. If we're looking at the rock as an example of who Jesus is, you don't need to strike it again and again and again. That would be a misunderstanding of who Jesus is in our life. All we need to do is come to Jesus. With our belief in our heart, faith to speak the words, and then speaking out loud. Romans 10:9 says, if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So if this rock is supposed to represent Jesus, it only had to be struck once for all time. After that, you only need to declare your need for salvation. Believe in your heart that God will save you. Moses should have gone to the rock, had faith to speak to it, and the water would have saved the people. I hope that's making clear here how we see Jesus in the story. If you're thirsty, there is only one place you can go to quench that thirst. And we're all thirsty, whether you realize it or not. Some of us have been running to the wrong things. Some of us have been digging in the wrong places. And it's time for us to find God's promises in the only place that God ever intended us to look, which is Jesus. Jesus said in John 10, the thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. So don't look anywhere else. And it's tricky. It's tricky because the substitutes aren't necessarily bad. In a lot of cases, they're even good. In some cases, they're vital. Relationships can be good. Success can be good. Food is necessary. I mentioned that earlier. So next time you think you might be looking in the wrong place, ask yourself if this choice is honoring to God. Ask if Jesus is with you in this relationship. Ask if Jesus wants you to succeed in this area. Ask if Jesus would join you in this meal. make sure you're digging in the right place. I'm going to invite our worship team to come up.